Hello and welcome, I'm Tafarag Damu. In February of 1937, exactly 81 years ago this month, following an abortive attempt on the life of Rodolfo Graziani, Italy's viceroy here in Addis Ababa, the city was to face a carnage of horrifying proportions. What exactly happened? In his latest book, Ian Campbell chronicles the massacre that went on for 3 long days. A very warm welcome to the program again.
Thank you very much for having me.
When was it? 5 years ago? 4 years? 5 years ago? We had you on the show when you just got the plot to kill Graziani published. That was a fascinating, marvelous book. And following that came the massacre of Debre Libanos. That's a monastery outside of Addis Ababa. And now, in 2017, the Addis Ababa massacre, Italy's national shame. You basically talk about the day after an attempt was made on the life of Graziani, right?
Yes.
And this is a carnage that went on for 3 days.
Yes, in fact, more than 3 days.
It started on a Friday, and it ended on a Sunday, but not so. I mean, it went on to Monday. Yeah.
Yes. 3 days was, of course, always the medieval period to sack a city if the attempts on that city had been resisted. And so there was a certain history to this business of 3 days carta bianca.
That's carte blanche.
Yes, carte blanche, do as you wish. And indeed, the Italian authorities did give 3 days to their soldiers and civilians to kill as many Ethiopians as they could. In fact, the killing did go on after the 3 days, considerably after the 3 days, because to some extent the black shirts, who were the voluntary militia under Italian military command, were very difficult to control.
Once given the orders.
Once given the orders, yes.
That Friday, a curfew, right, was put in place.
Yes. That was not spontaneous. I mean, there was a plan in place. At the time, you see, Addis Ababa was really quite under siege from the Patriots. It was a very difficult city to defend. And there was a plan in place that if there was an emergency, a curfew would be declared, and all Ethiopians would have to stay in their homes from that moment on. So that much was, you could say, according to plan. So at about 2:30 in the afternoon of the Friday concerned, this curfew was called for, and people were expected to stay in their homes.
And they did.
And they did, for the most part. Those who knew about it. Of course, there were no mobile phones in those days. So many people hadn't heard what had happened at the palace. They hadn't heard about the attempt on the life of Graziani. So several thousand people were still caught in the street, who were not aware of the curfew. But what happened after the curfew was that Carta Bianca was declared, carte blanche was declared in the afternoon. And what happened then was that during the course of the afternoon, men had been taken from their homes where they'd had to go due to the curfew and were rounded up into detention camps. So by the time Carta Bianca was declared late afternoon, the high proportion of the people who were killed in their homes were women and children.
How many detention centers did they have here in Addis Ababa?
Here, within the city, there would have been about 30 or 40 altogether.
Spread out across the town?
Yes. The longest term one was at Akaki, of course, which is still a prison. And there were several prisons which were used as short-term concentration camps, including the police garage, which is opposite the Sheraton Hotel. On top of that, yes, there was about 30 or so small detention camps which served the purpose for a few weeks. after the attempt on Graziani.
So do you have a figure for the number of people who've been rounded up and put in those detention centers?
Probably around about 10,000. You have to remember that the Ethiopian population of Addis Ababa at that time was about 100,000. And if you assume that about half were male, then the number of men in the city wouldn't probably have exceeded 30,000 or so.
And then when exactly did the carnage happen?
The carnage started at about 20 minutes to 12 on the day concerned, almost immediately after hand grenades were thrown at the Italian High Command, who were conducting a ceremony at what is now Addis Ababa University campus at Sidis Kilo. Almost immediately, machine guns opened fire. They had 2 machine guns up on the balcony above the portico, which you can, of course, still see today. Right. And they opened fire by about 11:45, and about 3,000 people who were assembled for the event were killed at that time. And that really, you could say, triggered the massacre of Addis Ababa.
But this is not the official launch of the massacre, if you will. I mean, Graziani didn't give the orders to start this.
That's correct. And that's why there's always a great deal of confusion as to what was the massacre and who did it and how many people died. I take the view in the book that the massacre was the death of all the people who died as a result of this attack at the palace, who would not have died had the attack not taken place. So the 3,000 people who died at the palace compound were never officially killed, so they were never recognized by the Italians as having died. They were not judicial executions. The only executions that the Italians officially recognized were those done by tribunals who held people to account and said that they were to blame and had them shot. And that number would be relatively small compared to the total number of people who died in the massacre.
You know that it was planned. It was meant to be, right? I mean, the massacre was going to happen one way or the other. How was it organized? I mean, was they said the black shirts were the prime culprits, right?
Yes, it's an interesting question. I mean, it was partially organized because Carta Bianca was actually physically proclaimed from the building where Castelli's restaurant is today to be found. And they were given, the Italians in the city were all given 3 days to do as they wanted. But there was also a standard practice that had been going on since the invasion started, that if Italians were killed in the countryside, that is Italian soldiers, there would be reprisals on the local people. And so many houses would be burned and churches would be burned and people would be killed. So there was a certain standard practice which was very well known to the black shirts. And many Italians are on record of having said, we were waiting for Carta Bianca to be proclaimed. So they knew what they were supposed to do. And it was a matter of waiting for the federal secretary of the fascist party to make that declaration.
And they wouldn't even stop when Graziani told them to on the 30th.
That's what you see, because Graziani told them to stop before their 3 days were up.
So they said no, they wouldn't hear.
Graziani got a message from Mussolini, who was getting concerned that the international community had heard about the massacre. And although he was still in hospital and actually quite unwell, he said that the massacre should stop. Principal reason was that the Italians had been arguing that the League of Nations should recognize their conquest, as they called it, of Ethiopia. And they didn't want any news to get out which would suggest that they were not in command of the country. So it wasn't so much that Mussolini felt sorry for the victims, it was more that the sort of, real politic of the day required this thing to be stopped. And here you had this dichotomy, the split between the fascist party on the one hand, who really controlled the black shirts, unless they were on active military service, and Graziani, who controlled the Italian administration. So some of the black shirts would take the view, well, Graziani told us to stop, but Cortese, who was head of the party, said we could carry on. He gave us 3 days, so we're going to carry on. So that's quite an interesting evidence that the Italian administration was not monolithic. There was always this tension between the party and the military administration.
And actually, Cortese gave the orders, right?
Yeah.
And he said he was told by Graziani, who was basically recuperating the hospital, right?
Yes.
And by your calculation, in just 3 days, 20% of the Addis Ababa population of Ethiopians was wiped out.
Yes.
Quite a carnage.
It's a huge number. It's not actually as high as the number that many Ethiopians quote.
Yeah, but even then it is really, really...
It's a huge number.
Yeah.
The number quoted in popular history is 30,000. But that 30,000 came from a statistical exercise done for the emperor in 1946 by a team of expatriate and Ethiopian statisticians who calculated that during what they called the Graziani massacre, 30,000 people died. But it didn't only happen in Addis Ababa. It happened in other cities. It happened in Jimma, it happened in Dessie, and so on and so on. Wherever there were black shirts garrisoned, there were massacres. So my final estimate of 19 to 20,000 is not incompatible with a figure of 30,000 countrywide. But of course I've not done any research on the other cities.
So they used kerosene to set, homes alight, and people were dying inside their homes. There were, cottages and so on, right? There was thatched roof and so on.
The homes they were burning were not the smart homes that were to be found around Sidis Kilo, for example, where the wealthier Ethiopians and the Armenians and the Greeks lived, because those houses were wanted by the Italians. The houses they were burning was basically thatched cottages that would actually burn down. But they were strong enough that they were difficult to get out of once the door was locked, and in some cases they actually put rope around the circumference of the house to stop the people getting out. Not in every case. There were cases known to me where the Italians let the family leave first before they burnt the house down and looted the house. But there were equally many cases where people died inside the houses. That was not so much of a shock for the Italians as you might imagine, because it was standard practice in the countryside during the invasion, and continued to be standard practice, for example, in northern Shoa, throughout northern Shoa, at least right up until 1939. I've spoken to elderly people from several families who know of cases, and in some cases their own family died in this way when there was a reprisal. So even that, the reason it happened so smoothly and so quickly was that it wasn't the first time it had happened. It was the first time that it happened in an urban area.
And the aftermath was so shocking too. You have corpses, all over the places, and so we're damped in like
There were far too many bodies to bury, so they were burned, and they were burned outside the cemetery at Gulele. There were far too many to bury inside the cemetery, and the Italians did not allow people to bury their family members who died, and that was one of the things that really brought hatred on the Italians, both from Muslim families and from Christian families. So it took several days, more than a week in fact altogether, for all the bodies to be carried in military trucks. Otherwise there would have been a terrible epidemics throughout the city. Some of the victims were thrown into drinking wells and rivers, about 500 people, and the remains of those people were found in the early 1940s after the emperor returned, after liberation, and they were buried at the cathedral of the Trinity, Selassie.
Europe didn't react to this carnage. For example, Britain was appeasing Italy.
Yes. Yeah. Here you had the difference between the reaction of the public in a country like Britain to what was going on in Ethiopia and the reaction of the government. And as you say, the government of the United Kingdom at the time was still trying to appease Mussolini, thinking that they could avoid him joining hands with Adolf Hitler and threatening the rest of Europe, which actually was really a miscalculation on their part, because I think it's clear that they were destined to join hands, and it was clear that they would. After all, although we think of as Mussolini being a junior partner of Hitler, it was Hitler who was a disciple of Mussolini at that time. So Mussolini was getting all the attention. And he got away with the invasion of Ethiopia. And once the other nations saw, including Germany, that Italy got away with the invasion of Ethiopia, it meant that Hitler probably would not be challenged if he invaded Czechoslovakia and Poland and so on. But that miscalculation at the time meant that the Ethiopians got no sympathy. So the appeals which Emperor Haile Selassie made at Geneva for something to be done about what was going on in Ethiopia fell on stony ground.
Your research is quite intriguing because you were not, running into published accounts. In most cases, there were very few and very brief too. The Ethiopians didn't leave much to work on in terms of accounts.
Well, the thing about this book is that I didn't ever plan to write a book about the massacre of Addis Ababa. It didn't even occur to me. My interest was the plot to kill Graziani, which nobody knew that there was a plot, in fact. And the massacre of Debre Libanos, because I happened to have been working in the Debre Libanos area. I had a monastery.
Yes.
But in the process of doing the research for those topics, I picked up more and more and more information about the massacre of Addis Ababa. I never thought anyone could write a book about it because there seemed to be too many gaps. But bits of information about what happened on this day in this place and what happened on another day in some other place, it was too fragmentary. But in the end, I thought, well, it's a shame so many people died, you see, in this massacre. And no report has ever been written. That struck me as very sad. It didn't seem right that such a defining moment in 20th century history had occurred, and it not be recorded. So it seemed the right and proper thing to try to put this report together. So then I started to put energy into trying to pick all these jigsaw puzzle pieces and seeing if I could fit them into a picture. And it was really the personal interviews that enabled me to put together all these disconnected fragments, because I could go back to individuals time and time again and actually walk around the streets of Addis Ababa, and they would recall, oh yes, I was here at such and such a time. They started remembering. So by cross-checking and cross-referencing all these different accounts over a period of many years, I finally reached that eureka point where I realized that there was a chronology. Now, if you read the book, it's sort of obvious. This happened, this happened, this happened.
Exactly.
But there were many false avenues which I tried, which didn't turn out to be the correct model of what happened. So, of course, you don't see all the false starts that I had. You see the final solution. Exactly. So that was the process. It was a jigsaw puzzle.
So, remind me of the places of interest. Much of the face of Addis has changed in the last several years. And all these places where things happened are no more.
Yes. One of the things...
Something that should worry us in terms of our connection to our recent past, at least.
Yes, it was something that emerged during the course of the book, but really only struck me when I finally read the text in its final draft, as it will strike a reader now. You sort of read the book and you think, oh, yes, I know that place. I know that street. I know that building. I've walked past there hundreds of times.
But many of them are no more there.
And then what's happened is that, you see, there was such a little has ever been written about the 1930s, partly because the emperor was not inclined.
Didn't encourage it.
Yeah, he didn't encourage it for various reasons. So little has been read that when you start, so little has been written that when you start reading this, you start to see that there's a connection between the heritage, the built heritage of Addis Ababa, the townscape, the buildings, the streets, and the story which they tell. Because now you realize, oh, there's a story to be told. All these places, all this whole human-scale city had a story to be told. And this indeed comes out in the book, although it wasn't intended at the time. And of course, this city of Addis Ababa is unique on the continent. It's the only capital city I know which really grew up through this strange hybrid culture of Ethiopia.
It's pretty organic.
Yes, it's totally organic. It wasn't planned by a colonial power or any such thing. And potentially it's a unique destination for tourists. Whether that aspect of the townscape can still be preserved with what's left, I don't know.
Much of it seems to have gone.
Much of it's gone, and even parts of the Ruby Sefer have now gone in the last few weeks. But most of Sidiskilo and Piazza still stands.
So need for preservation.
Yes, if it all goes, there'll be no story left to tell there. And of course, it won't attract tourists, because tourists want to get away from modern buildings. They would like to see something different. So one is still hopeful that some conservation program could be put in place within the dynamic development pattern of the city.
Well, Ian Campbell, we hope so. And thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure. Such a fantastic book. I had a very good read. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.